Hello friends, I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Assistant Professor at the Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. I am coordinating the paper on Sociology of Gender. Today we are going to discuss the module titled Gender and Disability. In this module, first we will look at gender issues and how they are closely linked with issues of identity. Further, we will also recognize that in terms of issues of women, disability becomes a very important position, and an understanding that women in terms of disability are laid in a marginalized position. Further, we will also look into the interlinkages between gender, inclusion, marginalization, disability and experience. Gender and disability. Within India, the fact that there might be a gender dimension to disability has only recently been realized. Das and Agnihotri indicate the incidence of disability is intersected or influenced by gender. The extrapolation of the available statistics, they have indicated that disabled women are marginalized much more than disabled men. Disability legislation also adopts a gendered approach, with the result that out of 28 chapters outlining various issues, not a single one addresses the problems of disabled women. While Indian cultural reality has never been favorable to the birth of daughters, as it is clear by consistent fall in the gender ratio, the onset of disability in a daughter is a fate worse than death. While women are fighting hard for equal rights in a patriarchal order, disabled women are rarely recognized as persons. The society that accepts the able-bodied norm subjects the disabled girls and women to the most inhumane treatment possible. This holds not only for those whose disability is very severe, but also for anyone who is different from the ideal form. Thus, right from the childhood, disability imposes a subordinate status on them and increases the likelihood that their rights will be ignored. Women with disabilities also face discrimination at the hand of the feminist world, which, as a frame to understand women's lives and position in a society, has not benefited disabled women, and the intermingling of disablement and gender marks the reality of a woman with disability in India. Opportunities for improving the quality of life of a disabled girl are virtually non-existent. Already living a life of subordination without education and employment, women can do without the burden of disability. As a mother lamented, wasn't it enough that we have a hand-to-mouth existence? Why did God have to add to punish us by further giving a lungri, that is crippled daughter? In a culture where being a daughter is considered a curse, being a disabled daughter is a fate worse than death, for she has to contend with both her role as a daughter, when what was desired was a son, and with a disability. The desire for sons has to be understood in the context of the ritual value of sons as well as the socio-economic burden in bringing up daughters. The construction of daughters as a burden is rooted in the cultural milieu that looks at daughters as parai. As Johari elaborates, one of the religious duties of the father is kanyadan, the unreciprocated gifting of the virgin to the husband and the family. Giving dowry becomes a part of this ritual. However, the implicit understanding in this practice, however, is that whatever you are giving will be perfect. The disabled girl, when offered a prospective son-in-law, has to be compensated accordingly. If compensation is not possible, then compromises like being married to a widower have to be made. Disability in a son, on the other hand, though traumatic, will still be far more acceptable, as it does not have to be given away. In the chapter on conversations with culture, I have spoken about the negative rendering of the disabled woman. Consequently, a culture in which arranged marriages are the rule, it puts a disabled woman in a difficult position. While there is a possibility of resistance, however difficult to this cultural arrangement for the normal woman, for the disabled girl it is an uphill task. Some disabled girls in the rich or middle class might be able to negotiate the difficulties inherent in the arranged marriages, albeit with a great deal of compromising. Disabled sons retain the possibility of marriage, as they are not gifts but receiver of gifts. Disabled as well as non-disabled men seek normal women as wives, therefore participate in devaluing of people because of their disability. The preference for a son in the larger Hindu community in India is in keeping with its religious philosophy, has now been coupled with technology that can prove a test to the screen and determine the sex of an unborn fetus. The 2011 census indicated a continuing preference for the male child over female children. The latest child-sex ratio is in 914 female against 1000 male, the lowest since independence. In a society where there is widespread female abortion, aborting imperfect children will not cause any stir or rancor. While there is ongoing discussion of the ethical contradictions that prenatal sex testing poses for feminists, prenatal testing to identify and adopt children at risk for disabilities does not get addressed. For disabled women themselves, these issues become secondary because cultural stereotyping denies them the role of motherhood. Disabled women are, however, denied the possibility of this fulfillment as marriage and procreation as both difficult achievements in a socially restrictive environment. The denial of women's traditional roles to disabled women creates what Fine and Ash term hopelessness, a social invisibility and the cancellation of femininity that can force a disabled woman to pursue the female identity valorized by the given culture but denied to them because of the disability. A great deal of thoughtful work by Indian feminists analyzes the impact of the evaluative male gaze. However, the essential difference between being sexual objects and objects of stare have not been understood. If the male gaze makes a normal woman feel like passive objects, the stare turns the disabled object into a grotesque sight. Disabled women contend not only with how men look at women, but also how an entire society stares at disabled people, stripping them of any semblance of resistance. Davis cites a scenario described by Annie Finger's interpretation of an imagined meeting between Rosa Luxemburg and Antonio Gramsci, each of whom are disabled, with Rosa being given the temporary power of the able gaze. We can measure the startled reaction as he glimpses him, the misshapen dwarf, limping towards her in a second-hand black suit so worn that the cuffs are frayed and the fabric is turning green with age. Her eye immediately drawn towards his disrupting in the visual field. The unconscious flinch, the retaliating that she's staring at him to rapid turning away of the head. Then, the moment after the consciousness that the quick aversion of the gaze was as much of an insult as a stare, so that she turns her head back but tries to make her focus general, not a sharp gaze, Comrade Rosa. Davis points out the irony is that Rosa has walked with a limp her entire life and yet she found this abnormal. This brings a throbbing pain in me when I realize that to remove the stigma is next to impossible. When books say, "Am I not a woman?" I get confused if I could say, "Am not I a disabled?" Few years back, when I went to see the marble sculptures of Alison in Trafalgar Square, my first reaction was that it was a wonderful example is found in the life of a disabled artist, Alison Lapper. Apparently, the artist Mark Quinn wanted to introduce some form of femininity. The adjacent lenses column seemed to be the epitome of phallic monument. A significant statement which was entitled Alison Lapper Pregnant could be appreciated. Nelson, who was crippled and blind, is thought of as a war hero. His disability does not enclose him and a pity is not aroused. A review told me that the able-bodied artist Mark Quinn said the sculpture makes an ultimate statement about disability, that it can be as beautiful and as a valid form as any other. My contention is that indeed disability is a social category, is problematic though beautiful but extremely complex. The statue is not the only personified courage and bravery but also signifies sexuality and maternity. I discovered that she is an artist in her own right who has created an inspirational series of photographic self-portraits with a child. The statue is in a way a portrait of resistance. With this sculpture seems to transgress normative ideals that it reminded me of the damaged part. In a way, the representation of the disabled body is opposition to ideas of beauty. In a society in India, any aberration from normally accepted archetype is seen as marked deviation. The impaired body becomes a symbol of infection. The ramifications of such historical rending are to be found in the North Indian Punjabi culture, where although girls are allowed to interact with their male cousins, they are not allowed to sleep in the same room. Disabled girls, on the other hand, are under no prohibitions. This reflects what Harlan Han calls asexual objectification, and also evidences the disregard of the dangers of sexual violation to which disabled girls are exposed. Assumption that sexuality and disability are mutually exclusive also denies people with deviant bodies experience sexual desires and refuses them recognition as sexually typical despite the differences. Indian feminist scholarship has also looked at embodiment along the axis of caste, class and historical phases such as the impact of colonization. However, the impaired body has not been considered as having analytical consequences. As Niranjana points out, focus on the body has been a symbolic one where the body is perceived as sign or a code important to the extent that it is suggestive as it may be to speak about the body as representing encoded social meanings as an image of a society or even a metaphor for society. The question remains whether these perspectives can acknowledge the materiality of bodies not merely as they are formed, represented in a culture, but how they constitute the lived reality of persons. Through this analysis take up issues of cultural spaces and the female body, there is no mention of the disabled body. This omission reflects the historical practice that continues to render the disabled invisible in a manner very similar to the invisibility experienced by blacks in a white racist society. It is ironic that feminists engaged with the issue of difference, united in their attempts to empower the powerless and transform social inequalities, have not picked up the issues concerning the meaning of empowerment for disabled women. While disabilities movement's failure to acknowledge disabled women can be fathomed as reflecting patriarchal character of society, it accepts and aims to be included in, at least within India, is disregarded by the feminist movement, which claims objectivity through its theoretical deconstruction of oppressive social suppositions, is less understandable. What is especially anguishing is that Indian feminist thought fails to recognize that the problematization of women's issues applies equally to disabled women's issues. In principle, some disabled women might have benefited from the activities of certain women's groups, but no documentation exists of specific instances. On the other hand, ample evidence abounds that disabled women are victims of domestic violence and sexual violation. However, when the national Indian media gave widespread coverage to a story about a woman with cerebral palsy being abused by her father, women's groups gave no more than a perfunctory response. Further, Indian feminist scholars have not attempted to develop theoretical responses appropriate to the situation of a disabled woman. Historically, the only instance that evoked a reaction from Indian women's groups was when a 14-year-old mentally challenged girls were compelled to undergo hysterectomies in a Sassoon General Hospital in Pune on 5th February 1994. The instance was reported in major newspapers on February 24th. The intervention from women's group came after these press reports. On the following case, I found that institution was catering to a large rural community that left developmentally disabled girls under institutional care. The girls, however, not allowed to wear pajamas with drawstrings as well as sanitary napkins with belts, as it was claimed that they may use these strings to commit suicide. The records regarding the stay have not been kept carefully, so it is difficult to provide exact details. What is important is that it was the absence of protective gear such as pajamas, undergarments, sanitary napkins made the management of bodily functions such as menstruation difficult. To deal with the problem of menstrual hygiene, the hospital decided to go ahead with hysterectomies. Notwithstanding this paternalistic deprivation of women's necessities, boys in the same institutions were issued pajamas, complete with drawstrings that could be easily turned loose than any sanitary napkin could be. However, in the case, the danger of suicide was apparently not perceived. Sadly, this instance was not translated into a broader effort to open a dialogue about enforced sterilization of developmentally disabled women. This failure indicates that Indian feminists still do not see women with disabilities as an important and enduring constituency. Though there are efforts which sought a ban on forced hysterectomy for mentally and physically challenged girls by the National Commission for Women and the CBR Network, a non-governmental organization. They have demanded a special charter for protecting the rights of the marginalized disabled lives of persons with disability, with separate provision for the protection of rights of women with disability. While there is strong emphasis on mainstreaming women's concern for self-development in the national policy documents on empowerment of women, the paradox of an hierarchy within hierarchy is evident because discussions about a certain groups of women considered lower class and caste, tribal and minority continue to be couched in welfare terms. This reflects a skewed attitude of mainstream feminists who, while sensitively exploring distress as a major component of women's lives, experience conveniently disabled women out of their focus. There have been changes in the last decade as issues of disabled women have been included in the women's movement. There have been some gains in participation as well as inclusion in the decision making in some organizations. Initially, the disabled women were speaking mainly to be converted, but being in a conference did provide the opportunity to listen to other disabled women talk about their lives and to understand that there are feminists with disabilities who are ready to work together to bring about a change in the lives of the fraternity. The 2008 Women's Studies Conference went a step further and discussed disability issues in a plenary, but still there were only 2 women delegates who were disabled among almost 500. Thus, while feminists fight against oppression in India in recognizing disability issues is not yet fully cognizant of them. Although the conference was accessible, access was defined in a limited way. The toilets were either too far away or not accessible. In another conference in Mumbai, where disabled women were present in large numbers, many workshops were held in locations that were unreachable, with no elevator access. Inclusion surely means more than just making nominal arrangements for those of us living on the periphery. For the first time, the mainstream Journal of Gender Studies brought out a special issue on disability, gender, and society. A lot more work needs to be done. This is a welcome starting point. While there are sensitive women who have heard the voices of their disabled relatives, colleagues, and friends within the broader feminist discourse and practice, a certain tokenism prevails. To really hear disabled voices, the women's movement has to acknowledge the socio-economic communication as well as architectural barriers that prevent disabled women from sharing their stories and engage in a public discourse. It is time that the women's movement interrogates ableism. This is seen in the women's surveys that are not physically accessible or that assume that accessibility is just a wheelchair, ramp and nothing more. For example, for women who are hearing impaired or visually impaired, accessibility may use using sign language or braille format. Ableism is also reflected in the kind of language that non-disabled feminists use while referring to feminists with disabilities. As for example, "You are so brave. It is really wonderful that you are able to get out and come to this conference." However, a lot is needed as women's studies departments have not included issues of disability. It could be argued that I am weaving where there would be a possibility of real dialogue between the feminist and women's groups and disabled women. It isn't that I am ignoring the possibilities of resistance, which in the face of no recognition can only be attributed to a sheer will to survive. Taking this into consideration, I could argue that women with disabilities have formed support groups and are in the process of challenging dominant constructions of disabilities. Also, Indian Association of Women's Studies created funds which helped in creating a module on gender and disability. It also went to the Women's Grants Commission in a way that a module was accepted. However, women's studies departments will take a long time to address disability. Also, owing to the absence of discussion among disabled women themselves, no group exists to collectively pursue the concerns of the disabled women and thus to influence both the disability movement and the women's movement. Right now, the voices of disabled women are restricted to academic settings where a double operation hypothesis is founded. This hypothesis takes the standpoint that disabled women experience a double disadvantage as they fare worse than either disabled men or non-disabled women socioeconomically, psychologically and politically. Disability compounds their already marginal status as women. Many feminist thinkers in the field of disabilities have objected to this double disadvantage approach since this literature does not empower disabled women. Says Morris, "I always feel uncomfortable reading about our lives and concerns when they are presented in these terms. When Lonsdale writes, for women the status of disabled compounds the status of being a female to create a unique kind of operation. I feel burdened by the disadvantage. I feel a victim. Such writings do not empower me. We have to find a way of making our experience visible, sharing with them, each other and with non-disabled people in a way that, while drawing attention to difficulties in our lives, does not undermine our wish to assert our self-worth." While Morris is absolutely right in her stand, the problem is that even the double disadvantage hypothesis failed to produce concrete action as the outcome of the feminist discourse, and the practice does not move beyond tokenism and rhetoric. The struggle in India is very similar to the battle that feminism, which was cognizant of difference between women, engaged with as a political movement. It had to fight continuously for the mainstream feminism to acknowledge the dangers inherent in adopting the universal category of women and by default the exclusions of those living on the periphery and margins. Says Elizabeth Weed, "For those outside mainstream feminism, women's experience never ceased to be problematic. The common ground of sisterhood long held as white feminist ideal was always more utopian than representative slogan. Worse, it was coercive in its unacknowledged universalism and unrecognized exclusions." Indian disabled women experienced this exclusion when feminist theory and practice in India continued to ignore their experiential realities of discrimination, ignorance and neglect. Feminists reinforced the construction of disabled women as being outside the hegemony of normalcy. Consequently, the much needed political action has not been forthcoming. The resistance offered by disabled women has only led to a superficial acknowledgement of differences with an implicit assumption that the core issue is gender. The perceived need is therefore to raise the gender issues presumably adequately enough to address all women's life regardless of their backgrounds and differences. At least this recognition is responsible for the emergence of a discourse about difference, but I cannot ignore the reality that this discourse has not been able to effect much, if any, change either in increasing the acceptance of disabled women's concerns in social policy or in enhancing the quality of lives. According to Menon, a more fundamental reason for the total absence of disability as an issue in the Indian women's movement and the comparative lateness of its emergence in the Western women's movement could be that feminists all over the world have usually assumed women to be a category that is self-evident. In one sense, this has been the internal colonization. That is, there is an unsupported assumption that all women, regardless of the differences from one another, have obvious shared concern. This abstraction of women emerged from a feminist posting of difference as a challenge to the abstract category of citizenship, which assumed masculinity as the norm. Up to the late 1970s, sisterhood is global seemed unquestionable feminist truth. The challenges of women from color and other stigmatized and marginalized group of women showed the category of women to be another abstraction, which in turn assumed the white, middle-class, heterosexual women to be the norm. In India, this kind of challenge has come from feminists of minority communities. The charge is that the women's movement has assumed the Hindu upper caste woman to be the norm, and this critique has emerged most clearly in the debates over the Uniform Civil Code. Menon, a vociferous activist in the women's movement and a political scientist by profession, feels that the invisibility of disability within feminism occurs because of mechanisms similar to those that have made women in general invisible in the larger society. But as feminists who felt disturbed by the neglect of disability studies, she thinks that the movement has a potential to grow and change. Another reason for the failure to represent women with disabilities is that within the Indian women's movement, there are far too many issues and far too few resources. Consequently, action has been oriented to the dramatic patterns that resonate in the lives of the majority of women who are able and normal, rather than to the minority who fail to exercise voice and agency. Notwithstanding the current reality of exclusion of disabled women within the Indian women movement, I would argue that simply deciding to include them is insufficient. The problem cannot be solved so easily by merely adding on disabled women as another category to the list of matters or kinds of issues requiring attention. Offering a feminist account of disabled girls is problematic because it requires including them in the discourse. However, writing a subject, for example, disabled women, into the ongoing discourse necessitates a certain exercise of power to construct the subject in some form, to give her shape and to breathe life into her. This cannot be accomplished without knowing how she might construct herself. This process requires a certain reflexivity. To explore the possibilities authentically and adequately requires the process to have a dialogical character. It is vital to both feminist discourse and practice engage in a concerted effort and a dialogue with the disabled women and the disability movement so that a more inclusive theory as well as practice can be emerged. The solution to these problems might come by following the example of Leonard in creating a paradigm of communication rooted in discursive strategies rather than the structure. Failure to create these spaces, even unintentionally, does not alleviate the asymmetry of power relations. Feminist discourse has developed without disabled women taking a hand in shaping it. What can now be done about feminist inattention to disabled girls and women, and how could feminist discursive attention look and read it if initially they had been involved in development? Do we need a different kind of feminist theory account for disabled women? We should address some of the specific issues currently addressed by the feminists, and one might look different when seen through the lens of disability perspective. One matter that within the ambit of feminist thought seems different from disability perspective is the issue of caring for mothers of disabled children in India. Instances are abound where women have been divorced, abandoned or tortured because they have given birth to a disabled child. Given the preference for son, even here the blame of the mother is more severe in the instances of a girl child. The fantasy of maternal omnipotence holds mothers responsible for providing the caring. Home care is the only option. There is often no question of choice. Indian feminists who have debated over the ethics of caring and who are now in the process of initiating a debate over equality in caring have not taken the note of the conditions in which disabled people, especially girls, are placed. Within the traditional Indian system, the mother has been the source of succor for the children, especially for the girls with disabilities. In the absence of social and community support, disabled women have relied largely on caring provided by mothers who are undoubtedly have carried the extra burden. Another significant area where feminist questioning would be invaluable concerns the area of independent living as exposed by disability theorists in the West. In the absence of education, employment, infrastructure and a social security system, autonomy is a formidable goal for women in India to attain, and more so for the disabled women. Mere recognition of the differences does not assure that we will construct an adequate representation of difference. Further, constant attention to difference might create and construct others who are unheard of and therefore unfamiliar. Thus, difference is dangerous, and very new context demands that we re-examine the difference. In concluding the model on gender and disability, we have raised few issues. First, there is an increased challenge of initiating a discourse on universal sisterhood as women are divided along axis of caste, gender, experiences, especially in terms of understanding of caste, race and now disability. Further, feminist movement has marginalized the experience of many kinds of women, and in this context the disabled woman. Further, it becomes very important to engage with the very idea of ableism for us to understand the concerns of the disabled woman. Further, within the feminist studies in India has put women and disability in terms of the discourse at the margins, and very unfortunately has reduced it to tokenism. Thank you.